One thing that has helped me, especially recently, is understanding my life as a parent as that I'm playing the long game. So there have been things that have happened with my children that, especially when they were teenagers, I developed like this reactive desire to fix things right away. And I would get ramped up about something they'd done and needing to fix it right away. But if I understand that parenting is a long game, and there is that large arc in our lives, then those smaller decisions that they make or those smaller things that happen don't matter as much. And I can think of things that happened when they were teenagers that I completely freaked out about. And I am so apologetic to them now because I think those things don't matter. Those things don't matter. What matters is that we have a good relationship with each other, that they trust me, and that we're playing the long game for as long as that game lasts.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. This is a podcast, but it's also live on Facebook, then repeats on Facebook, is posted, goes on YouTube, and then can be found wherever podcasts are found. And if you like this podcast and want to help us promote it, please share and also like it in the online interweb sense and pass it on. Today, I am talking to the author of Finding Our Way Forward. Here's the book. And her name is Melanie Springer Mock. And that's not the way I'm supposed to introduce her. I'm supposed to read off my information sheet here that my guest today is Melanie Springer Mock. Melanie is a professor of English at George Fox University and the author or co-author of 6 books, including the most recent, Finding Our Way Forward, When the Children We Love Become Adults. And first of all, I just wanted to give you a little visual proof of the fact I've read this book, and there's all the, what do you call those, dog ears, I think, in the book, underlined passages. Thank you so much. And we're going to dive in. So, Melanie, before we start, where are you right now? Where are you sitting?
I am at George Fox University in my office, which is in Newberg, Oregon, about 20, 30 miles southwest of Portland.
Okay, and I'm in Massachusetts, just north of Boston.
Okay.
And how long have you been teaching at George Fox?
I have remarkably been here 22 years. I'll be starting my 23rd year in the fall.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of that is in the book. So listen, I'm going to do something interesting that I haven't usually done with people, but I just was really struck by your book, which I enjoyed very much, by the way. I think it's lovely. But I'm going to dive in at an awkward place. And that is one thing that struck me in your book, 2 things, one which added up to something very unusual. And that is, usually when I read a book, you have a personal reaction as in, oh, wow, my life is a similar pattern, or I get this, or it's an area that I know something about. Or it's the opposite. I don't agree with much in here. This woman has had a very different life than me. Your book is interesting in that it did both things simultaneously. You're probably, in terms of life experience, in some ways, about as far away from my life experience in the big things you write about: family, romantic relationships, career, view of God, education, children, and all the rest, as anyone could get. I'll give you an example. You talk in your book about how you were praying for finding someone to marry, and years went by, and you didn't have someone. Question your faith. What's your problem? I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18. That's 53 years ago. I'm a father of 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren, 3 of whom live across the street that I do childcare for. So I came at it totally the other way. You went off and did all this fancy academic stuff, and you're a professor at a university. I ran away from a British private boarding school, what's called a public school in England, a swanky private school, when I was 15. Have not been back to school since. Have written 15 books and lectured at Harvard. So I've had my little taste of academic stuff, but totally counterculturally. I'm one of your kids that you're worrying about, except now all out.
Yeah.
So that's kind of some differences. Now, here's some similarities. You're a Navy mom, and I am a Marine Corps parent. I had no idea what my son was doing when he wanted this post-high school lark to enlist. You come from a sort of a Mennonite pacifist background, if you could put it that way. And it's like, well, why does my son want to be in the Navy? And in your book, here's the book again, everybody, you're worrying about, well, should I let him play this particular video game that made him like military stuff? I haven't read very many books by people that I've done on this podcast that share the bemusement that I had when my son went into the Marine Corps, or have been to a boot camp graduation. You and I have had such similar experiences that literally there are passages of your book that I could have written in terms of expressing the same emotion. In fact, I have. One of my books that sold very well was called Keeping Faith, a Father-Son Story about Love in the United States Marine Corps. And my passage about boot camp and trying to get used to the idea of a son enlisting, when I live on what I call the Volvo driving, higher education, worshiping North Shore of Boston, so parallel to yours. Your feeling for your children and grandchildren, your hard lessons of learned wisdom in terms of the humility of respecting their choices, your hope about future generations that are expressed here in a passage I'll read before we get going in our discussion, that just struck me so forcefully. Whether they are believers or not, members of Gen Z are praying with their feet. Despite facing innumerable threats to their lives, young adults are not necessarily paralyzed with fear, hunkering down in their homes to avoid the very real possibility of random mass shootings or race-based aggression. Instead, despite their anxieties, they are working hard to make change. For example, in the aftermath of the shooting at Marjorie Stoneham Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida in 2017, young people, especially those directly traumatized by the event, responded with courage and resolve. Within a month, several students had mobilized, organizing March for Our Lives, a demonstration for gun control that took place in Washington, D.C., and over 800 other sites worldwide. So in that paragraph alone, you sort of mobilize my sentiments about my grown grandchildren and my children and the world they're going into. So the funny thing is, you and I have had totally different lives, and yet we wind up experiencing the same thing and drawing the same conclusions in one area after another. Go figure. Over to you.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. I think I didn't know your entire story until I started listening to episodes of your podcast. And I think there are parallels in that we were both preachers' kids as well, different kinds of preachers' kids for sure. But yeah, my son's entry into the military was a complete paradigm shift for both my husband and I. Not just pacifists, but ardent pacifists. We've both written books about pacifism. And to have a son decide to enlist, it's a seismic shift for our entire family. But I think, as I think you are expressing, there is a need when you're parenting young adults or mentoring young adults for the kind of flexibility that allows yourself to be transformed by who they are, by who God created them uniquely to be. And so we have experienced that transformation over the last 2 years, and experiencing things that I never would have fathomed in my 50 years of life, going to a boot camp celebration and just being part of that whole ethos there was like, I just couldn't imagine that this was my life, but it was also very meaningful and helped me deal with some of my own bigotry about the military and about patriotism and things like that. So absolutely, I think that parallel with your son in the Marine Corps is intriguing. I don't meet many people whose children or whose families are not totally enveloped in military culture already when the kids enlist. So it's interesting to meet somebody who's kind of been on a similar journey.
Yeah, very much so. And in my own life, a couple books came out of that. As you have in your life, you reprocess what you're experiencing, as this book does, into your vocation as a writer. And I found, after John went to war in Afghanistan twice, because he enlisted just before 9/11. So he wasn't enlisting to fight in Afghanistan as if, okay, a call to arms. He was enlisting kind of as a post-high school, I don't want to go to college yet adventure. And then, of course, when 9/11 hit, it all became very serious. And So another book came out of that about, what it was like experiencing a son who was actually in combat and me being safe at home, which is something I know you could identify with as a parent. So let's talk about some other differences, and then we're going to dive into the book. I was reading with great intrigue and being moved by your experience as a parent going to Vietnam, and the whole adoptive process. Again, that's very different than mine. Sort of, if you were bookending the experience of getting someone who would become your wife pregnant when you're teenagers, here you are, a fully formed person, an adult. But at the same time, your concerns for young people and the way you talk about, for instance, I'll just pull a random thought out of the air here, something I love from your book when you're talking about people asking children what they want to be, or telling young people you meet, what are you doing next? And the kind of pressure that puts on people. I just found so much innate wisdom that's come from your profession as a teacher, but also as a parent. So with no further ado, let me just start going through some of the passages I marked in your book, and I recommend the book highly to people. And then I want to get into some areas, not so much of disagreement, but just questioning, because you are more in tune still, I guess, with some of the Christianity you were raised with than I am. I've gone away from the evangelical thing altogether, although you have terrific passages of questioning where things have gone in terms of Christian nationalism and all this sort of thing. One thing early here, you talk about in this idea that COVID has had such an impact on people. And of course, I just have a practical question. In the writing of this book, how past the COVID pandemic lockdowns were you when you were writing this?
Yeah, so I wrote this like January through August last year, 2022. So pretty much past it. Our university was still requiring masks up through a year ago spring semester. So we would have been wearing masks, but everything else had gotten back to normal-ish. Yeah.
But the book is very much colored by that experience, and I don't know how many times the word COVID appears if you do a word search, but quite a bit.
Yeah. Yes.
It had an impact on you, and I think that both as a parent, as an educator. Let me just jump into some areas here that you and I are so much on the same page for, because we often, this is what, page 55, because we often understand calling as an immutable decision we make in early childhood, early adulthood, and because we understand calling as primarily vocational, we exert certain pressure not only on young adults, but also on ourselves. This is also true when our vocational choices have included parenthood. And what I liked about this passage of the book is that you and I are very much on the same wavelength when it comes to, I guess, the way our culture defines the word success. And it's always related to career choices, income, and status. The question always, well, what do you want to do when you grow up, kind of thing, to younger children, rather than who do you want to be, as in what sort of human being. And your book has this sort of very strong ethical core where who we are is what seems to matter to you, not what we do. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. And that part has been a particular challenge for me. Both my husband and I are college professors whose children have both decided, our younger children have decided not to go to college. And so even as they were trying to navigate that and having parents just make the assumption that my kids were going to be in college, like where did they get accepted? Where are they going to go to college? And my having to deal with feeling defensive or having to justify their choices not to go to college, that was a real stretch for me. So it's been a process for me to work through too, to recognize and affirm that not everybody So my son now is working in a bagel shop in Denver. I think he's very happy in that role. He enjoys the camaraderie with his coworkers. And I have to be able to say that he's doing that is as worthy as the person who just graduated with an engineering degree and is going to be making $100,000 this next year. Like, we are all inherently worthy, and it doesn't matter what we do, what vocation we have. But too often, especially, even at my university, we use that language of vocation or calling kind of to force people into a successful career. And that's reflected even in the resources that are given to certain majors and not others, because we give tons of resources to engineering and nursing because we see those as important, viable callings in ways that maybe being a poet or an artist is not as viable.
Yeah, this is sort of reflected in this section here. Let's see, page 56. Helping young adults find their vocation is still important, but there are ways to do this mentoring well. The first step is to revise expectations for young adults, refusing to believe or affirm those cultural scripts that outline what a successful life will look like for us and for the young people we cherish. We might need to decide that college, and especially college at 18, is not the first step for every person must take into adulthood, or that attending college should not immediately choose, or those attending college should not immediately choose a major that promises a lucrative career rather than pursuing a liberal arts education that has the potential to make them better thinkers, communicators, and world citizens. Encouraging young adults to seek opportunities and experiences that deepen their appreciation for human nature, whether through travel or service industry jobs or volunteering with national organizations, might help them get a taste the vast array of options available to them. I have a question for you, and this is sort of cutting to the, right to the heart here, writer to writer. I find that a lot of times in my books, as I look back, that as well as processing my life, I use what I write in some ways to justify my own experiences as well as my views and what's happened to me. Would you be writing a passage like that if your sons were or children had taken a path that was more familiar to you, whether that's naval or working in a bagel shop, less familiar paths? Or has this caused you some humble reconsideration of things that before you experienced this yourself, you would not have put in this light?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it is humbling for sure. And also aspirational, because those are things that I still grapple with. Instead of saying that my son works at a bagel shop, I'm more inclined to say he works in the hospitality industry.
Yeah.
Simply because it's something that I'm still struggling with, trying to eternalize. So absolutely, the entire book could not probably have been written had my kids just taken the easy path, or the path that many kids take into adulthood. But I think because my children have struggled, because we face challenges as a family, I think that has made me a better professor, a better person, somebody who's more empathetic and understanding. And I hope that kind of empathy comes through in my writing.
Yeah, it comes through very strongly. It's one reason I really like the book. And, that kind of empathy can't be faked, by the way. I mean, I in that sense, having written myself, I know what I'm talking about. And I think that, it's very authentic here, which is one of the notes I love in the book. Another place where I run into authenticity of experience that you and I have shared, and I understand completely, I'm grieving the passage of time. This is what, page 63. All those child-raising years behind us, as well as everything those years held. When our kids are young, most every parent hears some version of time goes so fast and enjoy them while they're little, because before you know it, they'll be grown up. Some days the sensibility seemed impossible. My patience worn thin by tedious afternoons spent watching my boys climb around the playground, or freezing myself stiff at a kid-pitched baseball camp that went into extra innings. Those days dragged by in slow motion, and I couldn't wait until bedtime so I could have half an hour to watch television or read a book in peace. I find there's so much about parenting and so much advice on relationships that I just really dislike intensely these days, in the sense of a kind of a cynicism. On the other hand, the people who are into families, as I am, and I do grandchild care and enjoy it, often gloss over the boredom and the tedium of parenthood. So you either get snippy people telling you why it's great they have no children and how happy they are having made that choice, and they're 29 through 40, and I'm saying to myself as a 70-year-old who will be 71 this summer, I really don't want to listen to you until you're at least my age, because it's the whole arc of life that matters. Give you an example of that. When you're talking about your kid working in the bagel shop now, or somebody in the Navy, you're speaking as someone who is taking the status quo as where things will remain. But of course, my point of view is the same as when someone tells me they're having problems with a teenager. I think back to all the problems I had with my kids, or that I was myself, and I'm saying, hey, but it's a long road, and don't give up, or don't assume this is how it's going to last. Well, similarly on parenting, I think that we can make a good case for being a parent, a grandparent, and the love that is there, and perhaps talk people into afraid of having a child, or think they have to get all the bills paid first, whatever. But on the other hand, the truth of the matter is, like everything else, it's not all that it's cracked up to be. And I like that balance in your book. Do you want to riff on that a little?
Yeah. So one thing that has helped me, especially recently, is understanding my life as a parent as that I'm playing the long game. And I remind myself that I am playing the long game. So there have been things that have happened with my children that, like, especially when they were teenagers, I developed like this reactive desire to fix things right away, and I would get ramped up about something they'd done and needing to fix it right away. But if I understand that parenting is a long game, and there is that large arc in our lives, then those smaller decisions that they make, or those smaller things that happen, don't matter as much. And I can think of things that happened when they were teenagers that I completely freaked out about, and I am so apologetic to them now, because I think those things don't matter. Those things don't matter. What matters is that we have a good relationship with each other, that they trust me, and that we're playing the long game for as long as that game lasts.
Yeah, exactly. I sort of learned that lesson first in a kind of a backward way when I was still living in Switzerland, part of an evangelical community called Le Brie Fellowship that my parents started. And there was a niece in particular that I would help care for, who was little. And I was convinced that, she was going to have a terrible life. She was a difficult child, and then a difficult teenager. And I remember always pronouncing to my wife, Jeannie, oh, she's such a mess, this will never. And Jeannie would always say, you don't know that, she could turn around. Well, by God, she did. And she's a fabulous person, and became a fabulous parent herself. And it's like, I don't know who that kid was, but it wasn't her. And I kind of learned that. So by the time my own kids came along, when I would make a similar mistake, Jeannie would always say to me, oh, well, I don't mind using her name. We're good friends. So she would say to me, well, remember how Natasha turned out? You were so wrong. It all was fine, because I'd be talking about my son, John, or this or that, or somebody else. So finally, now I'm a grandfather of grown grandchildren as well as little ones. I think at least I've learned that lesson. So that it's like I've got a little bit of a long view, because I've lived long enough to actually see documentary evidence in my own life and people I've known as children, and really see how their lives turn out, rather than that sort of gripping fear at the moment because John's crawled out his window again at 4 a.m. to go smoke cigarettes up on the street, and I found out again. And it's like, oh, this is going to end so badly. Well, it didn't. He's across the street with 3 kids of his own. He's a wonderful person, a great father. He survived the Marine Corps. The old Mark Twain thing, everything, what is it, feared most never happened kind of thing. Well, and I'm sure you're younger than me, but you've lived long enough already to at least see the beginning of the truth of what I'm telling you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I had one of those 4 a.m. sneaker outers too. So I understand how that fear can grip you, but I already see he's coming into a new place as an adult, and it's absolutely a delight to engage with him at this new place. And I wish again that I would not have catastrophized those 4 a.m. sneaking outs.
Yeah, I love the catastrophized word. That's such a good description of exactly. And of course, that's the whole young parent thing. But it also strikes me some of the Gen Z people and the iGen folks, they have a very catastrophized view of life, in the sense that they have these real horrors, climate change, massive violence, a strong right wing rising up that seems to hate them and hate young people. It's sad to see that bleed into, hey, I don't even date anymore. It seems that a lot of young people don't understand that life itself is not a series of catastrophes, and that it can grow and be okay, even in the cloud, sort of like reading a love story set in World War II Britain. They were about to be invaded by the Nazis, and they were fighting for their lives, and yet people were still getting married, people still had children. And they're glad they did, because when the war ended and they'd won, life went on, didn't it?
Yeah. I just got back from spending 3 weeks in Costa Rica and Panama with 21 junior level students from George Fox, and I see that tension in them. They are delightful young people, and I had amazing 3 weeks just interacting with them and seeing their worldview and their understanding of their place in the world, their sense of justice, but also the tensions they feel, knowing that the world, we were in this rarefied space for 3 weeks. They were going to come back into a world where they were going to experience all those pressures and the challenges of mass violence and the sense of insecurity and stability in their own lives. And I think what we can give to those young people is just the gift of time to listen to them and to listen to their stories and their grief and the challenges they are facing. Because I found in the conversations that we were able to have over the dinner table or on the bus, a new understanding of who they are and what they fear, but also that they just want to be listened to. They want their stories to matter. They want to know that the adults in their lives respect them, respect their challenges, and are there to help nurture them into adulthood.
I want to pick your brains on something, because you have a lot of wisdom in this book, and this is not a rhetorical question. I really want to know what you think. I'm not fishing for anything, but I, like many people my age, find the rise of the tech generation problematic, in the sense that I really find it distressing to not make eye contact with people. I walk my dog every morning on a beautiful rail trail, and I'm always listening to the bird songs. And I see these young people march by with earbuds in. They can't hear the birds. They're listening to something else, staring at a phone. And I'm not some, old fart judging them. I literally feel sorry for them, in the same way that when I pass a traffic accident and I see someone lying on the street, the fact there's already an ambulance crew there means I don't stop. If there wasn't, I have in fact saved a few lives in my time, weirdly. But I literally want to reach out and tell them, shake them and say, listen, two things. First, look at the morning around you, listen to the birds. Secondly, I'm an interesting person. I would talk to you. And if you stopped for 5 minutes and had a conversation with me, you'd find that I'm worth the time, and I would help you if you needed help. You're never going to meet me now, because I've said good morning and you didn't even hear me, and you walk by, and I genuinely feel like I'm looking at someone who is injured. I don't know if you share that, whether that's my ageism and age and prejudice, or whether they really are as injured as they look to me, because I think this is a lost group of people, and I think tech is literally destroying their opportunity to make human connection. Am I catastrophic?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Used to be when I would walk into a class before it began, the students would be engaging with each other, talking, and now they're all silently sitting on their phone. And that honestly gives me a sense of sadness every time I walk into a room and I see that they are just looking at their phone rather than engaging with other people. I think in some ways they're doing that as a self-defense mechanism. It's a way of avoiding creating strong relationships with other people. It's a way of inculcating this image of not being alone. I think loneliness is endemic in this generation, and people want to give the perception that they are not alone. And so being on their phone, engaging with other people on social media gives that sense of not being alone. But again, on my trip this last 3 weeks, it could be that they didn't have data in Costa Rica, but students were not on their phones very often. They were engaging with each other. They were enjoying nature. They were taking pictures of nature with their phones. But I just think even getting students out of an environment where they feel like they have to have that phone as their pacifier, getting them talking and engaging with each other and with adults is just one way that we can move them away from their sense of needing to engage on social media. But I feel despair about it, especially with my sons are both fairly addicted to their phones, and I wish they weren't. But so are my parents. My dad is addicted to Facebook and is on Facebook all day, every day, and models that for his grandkids. And I don't know, I think we also need to do some self-interrogation and realize the ways that we are also addicted to our devices, and that if we can model that detachment, maybe this younger people will recognize that as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's a big concern of mine. I look back over the trajectory of my own life, and there are a lot of things, as I said a few minutes ago, that I worried about that didn't turn out to be as much of a catastrophe as I thought. But I have a very bad feeling about the way these algorithms are written deliberately, addictively, and what they've done.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think an individual kid, whether 8 or 18 or 28, is any match for this kind of theft of their time and energy that this represents. I want to just change the subject a little bit here and go to a theme that you talk about a lot here, page 131. I'm sure most of us can catalog instances where mercy was lacking in our response to young people, including those we love most. And of course, in a way, that's a good segue from what we've just been talking about, but I don't think it's a lack of mercy when you're looking at someone feeling sad. You know, and I'll give you a personal example. I can, you know, I remember the first kiss I had. I think I was 14, and there was a French girl staying in the village unrelated to my parents' ministry. Ironically, she was the niece of the local Swiss pastor of the state church. And the way we met and held hands all summer, and my first kiss with her is light years away from not just online dating, but the introduction of sexuality through online porn and so forth and so on. I'm not saying I was innocent or, you know, holding this up as some wonderful thing, but again, I just feel the opportunities for what I would call raw, face-to-face, tactile human experiences, whether it's a first encounter with sexuality or something else, are diminishing for young people. I just find it so ironic that in the post-sexual revolution environment that came out of the 70s and 80s, where we have studies now done on sexuality that instead of leading to sort of a permissive society that would have been predicted, say, by my father in the quote, what'll happen when everyone, you know, joins this new pagan, non-Christian, post-Christian or humanist society, that younger people seem almost afraid of connection to the point where there's less involvement. It's all had the opposite effect. Do you want to, it's not the subject of your book specifically, but you're teaching and you see people, just talk to me a little bit about what you're finding.
Yeah. So again, I'm teaching in a rarefied space of an evangelical university, kids who grew up in evangelical homes often, and they come in with completely different, and I think also problematic messages about the ideas of purity and modesty and things like that. So I think if there are two sides of the spectrum, there are many sides of the spectrum, but if there are two sides of the spectrum, I think both sides are getting it wrong in how we talk about sex and sexuality and introduce that to our young people. And I honestly, I don't know what the answer is. I think what is happening now in schools, in communities where people are trying to ban books or challenge books as a way of protecting children, I think that's also the wrong way to talk about things like sex and sexuality, and that we need to have civil, informed discourse with our students, but that needs to be in conversation. I know that you value conversation and relationship as a foundation for our lives together. And I think that needs to be at the center of our instruction with young people too, is being in conversation with them, even when doing that is difficult or challenging. And I don't think that parents are having those conversations with children enough, or even having those conversations with each other about their own struggles. Instead, we live in these silos. We try to get through the challenges of our parenting alone without doing that in community.
Yeah. Let me just reintroduce you here. This is Frank Schaeffer. You are listening to and or watching my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am an author and a writer of both fiction and nonfiction, and a painter and a commentator. And my guest today is Melanie Springer Mock, and her book, Finding Our Way Forward When the Children We Love Become Adults, is something that I would highly recommend as both a parent and grandparent, but also as a writer. Melanie's a good writer. This is a lovely book to read. And as I showed her at the beginning of the program, I've dog-eared it all the way through, and I've been reading quotes. I want to shift gears here with you, Melanie, and take a deep dive into something a bit different, which comes out of having just read your book, and also about the school you teach in, which is an evangelical school as you defined it. My own journey has been one away from evangelical Christianity, and that's been quite a radical journey given where I started. I don't mean I am a radical, but of all the gin joints in all the world, kind of likelihood and unlikelihood that Francis Schaeffer and Edith Schaeffer's son, founders of Liberty Fellowship, an intellectual giant in the evangelical community, even to this day, let alone in the 70s and 80s when he was also a hot personality. The idea that I would rebel and leave would be easy to understand, but I didn't rebel and leave. I journeyed to a very different place, not out of rebellion or anger, but because I really became disenchanted with the movement and felt that I was literally on the wrong side in every sense of the word. But also, that journey away began when I started comparing the humble little ministry I knew as a child before my father became famous to where I found myself in my late teens and early 20s, up into my almost my 30th birthday, which was sort of at the big time God business end of the religious movements in America, which really seemed like being part of a sort of a Roman pagan bacchanal compared to the Christianity I was raised with.
Yeah.
So I kind of started my journey out of evangelical Christianity, not because I suddenly overnight woke up and discovered I was an agnostic or an atheist or somebody did something bad to me, but quite the reverse. And that is, either what I was raised with was Christianity, this small open community that accepted anybody and took care of them, irrespective of whether I believed any of it's true or not, just on the basis of how people were treated, my parents' integrity, and what we then became part of, in the big time religion movement. Since then, I've journeyed a long way. I wrote a book called Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, trying to show the paradoxical relationship I have with religion, of not being a believer at all, but yet still get up in the morning and pray for my children, and this kind of acceptance of paradox and so forth. So my question to you, with that very long preamble, is having read your book and seeing that you're a perceptive, intelligent, compassionate, and humble person, I don't know why you still consider yourself an evangelical and or would teach at an evangelical school. I know this sounds horrible the way I'm going to put this, but I often wonder, is it because you're there because you're used to this, you were raised that way? Are you a true believer? If so, I know because I've read your book that life is a journey. So however you described yourself when you were 20 is not what you're saying now.
Right.
But I want to know the arc of your journey and how you're making sense of the fact that, how you see things differently now than you used to, where you think this may take you. Do you take it as a foregone conclusion you're always going to be an evangelical? Are you at an evangelical school, so you have to be? I'm just throwing everything out at once and get anywhere you want, but I'm just curious.
Right. So I would not consider myself an evangelical. I don't identify as evangelical. I grew up in the Mennonite church. My dad was a Mennonite minister, fairly progressive, actually. Mennonites are also on a spectrum, and we were in the most progressive conference for Mennonites. I actually came to George Fox then college as a student in the late 80s, and that's my first encounter with evangelicals, and it was truly a cultural shock for me. My parents had pretty much taught me that if you were a Christian, you were a Democrat, progressive, that you abhorred the military, that you were not patriotic. Those were all foundational things in my upbringing. So when I came to George Fox, and most Christians were Republicans and very patriotic and singing with their arms raised and giving testimony, all those things were completely new to me. But I had a wonderful experience at George Fox, in part because of the professors in the English department were both deep, weighty Quakers who really taught me a different kind of faith. So when I went away to graduate school and then came back to the area because I was marrying somebody here, and then a job opened up at George Fox, I was grateful for the job. And obviously I love being here. I've been here 23 years, or will be 23 years. I would say first, the English department here at George Fox, as at other institutions, is far more progressive than other departments on campus. And I feel support in my spiritual journey, in my deconstruction of evangelicalism, even though I'm not an evangelical. All those things have been supported by people in my department. But yes, it is a struggle. It is a struggle to see the rise of alt-right students here on campus. It's a struggle to see some of my faculty peers in other departments writing about Christian nationalism in a positive way. So it's a struggle to see the ways that my university institutionally has marginalized certain voices, including LGBTQ plus students. And I chafe against those things, but I also feel that students know that I'm an ally, and they know that there are people on campus who will have their back, even when those students face repressive peers, repressive professors on campus. So that's one of the reasons I stay here, is because I see myself as an ally for students who are on the margins. I stay because I'm in a department that values my own faith journey and knows that I am cynical about evangelicals. I've written at least 2 books that have been cultural critiques of evangelicalism and biblical womanhood. Those are out there in the ether. And yet my university continues to let me have a voice here. So those are the reasons I stay. I stay because of the students. I feel like the students, getting to see them as first-year people, and then their journey through 4 years into who they become as seniors, it's a delight to see many of them open up their minds and become who God has created them to be too. So those are the reasons I stay, and I'll stay probably as long as they will continue to have me.
Yeah, which is how long would that be in terms of just the direction of the culture?
Right.
Easter School's not in Florida, where you couldn't teach certain things now. But I just wonder how you see that panning out.
Well, that is frightening. There was an example of somebody at Palm Atlantic University, which is a conservative Christian school, lost his job, an English professor, this spring because he was teaching racial justice in one of his English classes. The same thing happened at Taylor University in April. An English professor lost her position there because she was teaching some books on racial justice, and they were considered critical race theory by some board member, and so the woman lost her job. I do worry about that. I think what I know about the administration right now and its commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we're not on the same trajectory, but it certainly is a concern.
How do kids who are gay or trans or suffer from some sort of gender dysphoria or dealing with that, you must run into this once in a while, because people are people, whatever their religious affiliation. How does the school deal with them? How do they feel going there?
Well, students make the decision to come because they want a good Christian university. I would say in the last 10 years, there's been a dramatic shift in how students are accepted, are treated at the university. About 3 or 4 years ago, we had the first openly gay worship leader for chapels, which was a big thing. Students still feel repressed on campus, though, and there's an excellent ministry right across the street run by a former professor called Table 14, and it's a support group for gay and lesbian, trans students. They can just walk right across the street and find full support and a community there. That organization has had fundraisers, and I've gone the last few years, and there are more and more George Fox faculty going to those fundraisers. They had their own graduation in April, and a number of George Fox faculty were at that graduation. So I feel like we're still trying to straddle the line and what we can do as far as support, but I feel like those students are finding pockets of support in ways they wouldn't have even a decade ago.
Yeah, well, that's heartening.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll get some refugees from Florida and Texas come moving.
Yeah. Yes, that'd be nice.
Let me ask you, in terms of the trajectory that comes out of this book, Finding Our Way Forward. This question, it's the way I was going to put it sounds odd, like, who is this book for? Of course, it's for people who have kids or are parenting or teaching, but also just anybody who wants to read a lovely book, a well-written book on the subject of this. But I guess, in the best of all worlds, who are the readers you would hope Finding Our Way Forward, when the children we love become adults, finds? Who were you picturing when you were writing this book as a reader? And I forget, I'm sorry, I should know the pub date on the book, but when did it come out?
It came out in February of this year.
Okay.
And as I was writing, I was thinking about myself in part, and the loneliness and isolation I felt when my kids were struggling, and my fear of sharing with other people that they were struggling, because I didn't want that condemnation on myself and my parenting. And I think had I read a book like this when I was struggling, I would have felt less alone. So I was thinking about those people. But I was also thinking about my students. One of the other amazing things about teaching as George Fox is the relationship that I get to build with students. I get to hear their stories, and so often they share this grief of their parents not understanding them, judging who they are. And so I was thinking about my students and longing for them to be known by the parents in their lives.
When you say they find themselves judged, do you think that's a generational thing, or kind of a theological kind of judgment that they're looking at their kids as sinners or something like that because they're not doing what they think they ought to be doing?
Yeah, so I imagine some of that is generational, but with that patina of evangelicalism, that the kids aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing because they're not doing the evangelical thing.
What should they be doing from their parents' point of view that are judging them?
Attending church regularly, even though the churches are often alienating spaces for young people. Not getting tattoos, finding their spouse, finding their one during college so that they can settle down, finding a vocation that will pay them well as they move forward, finding independence, but also a connection to the adults as the adults see that connection or understand that connection. So I think young people feel all these expectations for who and what they're supposed to be, and that they have disappointed their parents because they don't live up to those expectations.
Yeah, how does that sort of expectation relate to your own relationship with your kids, in the sense that they're not doing exactly what you would have foreseen when they were, say, 10 years old? On the other hand, you're wise enough to let people take their own road. They're also on a journey. And you're saying you have a good relationship with them. In your own life, how has that all worked together? And what are your own struggles right now in terms of those factors?
Yeah. Well, I think it continues to be a challenge. Even the simple thing of, do I text my kid today? Or is it too many days in a row where I'm texting him and wanting him to respond to me? The son who's in the Navy is getting married this weekend. He's 21. I worry about that he's too young. That his fiance and he are starting out life without a lot of experience.
Where did he meet her?
He went to George Fox for a year and met her in his first month at George Fox. So
what was she studying?
She studies social work, and
what
she just,
what was he studying at George Fox before he went into the Navy?
Well, good question. About 5 different majors in his first year. So that was one sign that maybe he was struggling in college.
I didn't quite get the story straight in the book. Forgive me for not giving it a closer reading, but did he, I know he was in college because my son went into the Marine Corps right after high school and then went to college after serving. So really he started college at 24.
Okay.
And came to it much more prepared. But I just wondered, how much did your son go who went into the Navy before enlisting?
He went 1 year.
And then he enlisted.
And he enlisted,
Okay.
But by that point he met Kelsey in September of his freshman year. In one of my books on biblical womanhood, I critique this idea of the Christian college ring by spring culture, which says you meet your spouse in the first semester and then you get married by your senior year. And that's what my son is doing, essentially.
And he's joined the Marine Corps, and you come from a Mennonite pacifist background.
Right.
Is there anything he's done that is in line with who you are? And I'm being facetious, but I'm just curious. It's so interesting.
No, he's a remarkable young man, and I think he manifests his parents' influence in a lot of ways that have been a delight to see. But he is his own person, and I just wrote my speech for his wedding reception, and in part it's talking about the ways he's pulled me into cultures that I never imagined being part of. He was in Taekwondo.
Navy mom.
He was in Taekwondo, which is a sport I know nothing about, and so I had to learn what Taekwondo was. So all these things that he's done have helped me become more of who I think I'm created to be. And part of our response as older generations, I think, is to have that openness of letting our young people teach us who we are supposed to be ourselves.
Yeah. So tell me about his road to Taekwondo and the Navy from his Mennonite background. How do you see it? And I love the fact he's getting married young. Good for him. I did too. He's going to be fine. Tell him to call me, and I'll help him figure it all out. Jeannie and I have been together 53 years now, and I wouldn't change anything except my issues with anger and stupidity, but and the learning curve I had. But they'll be fine. So tell me a little bit about where this wedding's taking place.
It's taking place in Boise, near Boise, which is where she's from.
Excellent. What kind of a family is she from?
She's from a fairly conservative family. She was also adopted. She's from China originally. And so I think they share that particular bond.
Well, you talk about the racial differences in your family, and these were adopted kids. So again, and I know you were in Vietnam, but I didn't keep track of who everyone is sort of genetically. Where's everybody from?
So I have a son from Vietnam, Ben, and then Samuel is from India. We adopted him when he was 3. I also have 2 stepchildren who are 42 and 38. My stepdaughter married a man from India. So he and my stepdaughter actually look like my son's parents. I mean, it's a dynamic and crazy and wonderful family. So very multicultural. But we'll all be together this weekend. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, well, you have paid your diversity multicultural dues. No more is required of you.
Yeah. If only it worked that way.
Yeah, you're fine. You've paid. You gave it the office.
Yeah.
You don't have to be nice anymore. You're a nice Mennonite. Your son's in the Navy. Hey, you can do whatever you want now.
Yeah, for sure.
So how big is the Mennonite Navy Mothers Club?
Right now, I think it's just one person.
Yeah, it's you and one other woman who got hit by a truck on Thursday. So you're alone.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I'm sure there are probably more out there than I know. I finished reading a memoir recently, and the person was talking about men in his community who went into combatant roles in World War II and came back to their Mennonite communities and were ostracized at that point from their Mennonite communities. So I know they exist in other wars. I just don't know if they exist right now.
Yeah. When you go down to this wedding, are you going to spend a lot of time down there? Is this just a quick trip down? And then what are they going to be doing? Where will they be living?
So they're going to be, he is stationed right now at Camp Lemoore, which is a naval station near Fresno.
Mm-hmm.
So they will be moving there. He's actually been on deployment the last 8 months and just got back in late April from deployment to Lemoore. And so they'll be there together.
And this is apropos of your book, and tell me to mind my own business, but I'm just curious. Do either of these two boys go to church anymore at anything? Do they have any sense of a religious affiliation or not?
My younger son, no. He watches ministers on TikTok, so that's something, at least. My older son does not go to church either, but he, I think, would identify as an evangelical Christian.
This is the Navy son.
The Navy son, and it's all wrapped up in that sense of God and country and things like that.
And how about his wife to be? Is she an evangelical?
Yeah.
So she still you go ahead.
She also doesn't go to church as well.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I just think your family represents, it's wonderful. Like if you were going to do the typical family, you've got all the elements there, because I guess they tick the nun box, N-O-N-E, you know, in terms of religious affiliation, and yet they also tick the spiritual box. You know, he's in the Navy, he's at that point. It's really interesting, and that you have family yourself. I don't know who's alive in your family and who's tracking with the way these kids are, quote unquote, turning out. What's the reaction there, if any?
I would say my parents are pretty supportive. They're both still living and live in a Mennonite retirement community in Goshen, Indiana. Very supportive of my kids. My mother-in-law is still living. She lives in a Quaker retirement center here in Newberg. She has she watches Fox News and Newsmax and those kinds of things, so has a lot of fears about young people and who and what they're becoming.
Yeah, so you really are interesting because you are so well read, and your writing is so good, and you have such a lovely spirit in this book, Finding Our Way Forward when the children we love become adults. And yet at the same time, the book comes from a place in you that is very fraught and ongoing and difficult, almost like you're going to have to send out follow-ups. You know, we need to just have sort of a website where we can check in, and now what are they doing? Now what are they doing?
For sure, which I imagine was one of the problems of writing a book while you're still in the midst of everything.
Well, we're all still in the midst of everything. You know, I wrote a memoir, Crazy for God, about 15 years ago, but I waited until I was kind of in my 50s to do it. I mean, I'd never planned on it, but I kept getting questions because of other books like, well, what about now? What about now? And why don't you give us the real story instead of putting all in novels and so on? What is coming out of the questions you've gotten from your former books or your own kids that produced this book and or whatever you're working on now? What's for the future? Are you going to give us a big, thick memoir sometime on Mennonite naval mom?
You know where my heart is right now is actually, we kind of skim this topic, the challenges facing teachers and educators and the curricula they're choosing for their young people. In my own community, an alt-right school board has completely decimated our school district. And so that's where my heart is right now. That's where my activism is now. And I imagine some of the writing I do going forward will come out of my experience of reckoning with what is happening in our schools and to our children, and the kind of control that's being forced on them by Christian nationalists.
What did the school board in your area do specifically, and how did they get into their positions of power?
Well, I don't think people were paying attention. They developed a 4-3 majority, which made it possible for them to fire a very popular superintendent. They started
On what
a
grounds?
ban.
Why did they fire that
No
superintendent?
cause. No cause. They had written a policy banning pride or BLM signs in classrooms. The superintendent said he wouldn't enforce that policy, and then they fired him. As a result of that, the 3 progressive school board members quit. Because they were getting death threats and things like that. More alt-right positions were being put in. Almost 200 educators left our district as a result of the school board. Over 150 students left the district. It's in disarray right now. 5 progressive school board members were just elected in May. So hopefully we can start turning the ship. But when 200 educators leave your district, that's decades and decades of institutional memory that are now gone.
Yeah, it's
And
almost
so,
like a template of the future that we face with either DeSantis or Trump or the triumph of any of these folks, because this is the program, isn't
absolutely.
it? Take over control locally, school by school board, and you wake up one morning and all of a sudden you don't recognize anything.
Absolutely. So I feel like our district is kind of a warning for other districts and what can happen if people aren't paying good attention.
Why don't you write a book about that?
I'd love to. This has just been my lived reality in the last year. So going forward, that I'm starting to do some writing and publications about that, and I'm hoping that works into something bigger.
Yeah, you know, my producer Ernie just sent me a little note in the chat section. This is happening in school systems everywhere, and of course, Ernie and I both know that, and do a lot to try to speak to it. But then, you know, it sort of goes back, and then we're going to wrap this up in a minute. But to my original question, in terms of the drift of evangelicalism, you know, it used to be that you had theological discussions or disagreements, or you'd say, oh, you know, this Pentecostal group is sort of goes places we don't go, but we're all Christians, quote unquote. But now it just seems to me that even my dad, who died in '83, if he came back now and saw what had been made of his work and some of the doors he opened for this alt-right movement, I think even the old guard of Christian leadership, I know in the case of Billy Graham, who I knew well personally as a young man. I mean, I didn't know him as a young man, he knew me. And my dad, I think at this point, we've crossed a line where even defined by the way evangelicals would have defined themselves, say circa 1970, you know, this is no longer a movement that involves Christians. This is a straight out nationalist, quasi-fascist movement using all the methods of authoritarian takeover, surreptitious, sneaky attack, not accepting election results, and so forth. Just to end on a bit of a dark note, because this is where your heart is right now. I don't mean a dark note, but fighting these battles. What do you think is going to happen?
That's a great question. I have no idea. What happened in our community is that people came together, found each other, and then fought against the alt-right and changed the trajectory here. Tying in my book, I think that Gen Z really can be an answer. We see them fighting against these repressive policies. We see them, like in Tennessee in April, I believe, or March, standing up against gun violence in the state house in Tennessee. I think their passion and their advocacy and their thirst for justice can save us, but we have to, honestly, I think that's one of the things that Christian nationalists fear. They know that they're losing power, so they're going to try to clamp down as much as they can.
Yeah, and they've made young people their enemy.
Yeah.
They've targeted them. I mean, by just actually targeted younger people. Like, since when does the older generation actually turn against the future?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think, and I hope they've made a grave mistake in turning away a whole generation of voters.
Well, and of course, it's a grave mistake if the electoral system holds, but if you don't accept any
Right.
result except a win, and
Right.
you charge into the Capitol every time you lose an election, then,
Yeah.
you know, forget it. All bets are off.
Yeah.
We don't know where
Yeah.
that goes, because that's insurrection and revolution. That's not democracy anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of which, did your local school board accept the result of these new people, or did they say that too was a fraudulent election?
No, they did. I was worried about that because we have a county clerk that has shown herself to be in the pocket of the right. But yeah, they accepted the results, and the new school board will be sat in July, and hopefully can get to work changing the policies that have been a problem. And I will note too that the new school board is made up of a coalition of people, Republican, independent, and progressive, but who have reasonable thoughts or a reasonable sense of what the school should be. So I think if people can form coalitions and work together, we can hold off this all right movement.
Well, that is a good note to end on. And once again, my guest here today is Melanie Springer Mock, and Finding Our Way Forward When the Children We Love Become Adults is her current book. Her next book is going to be on how to reclaim a school board that's been taken over by fascist revolutionaries. That might be the title, How to Reclaim Your School Board When It's Been Taken Over by Fascist Revolutionaries. I'll give you that for free.
Thank you.
And you tell that story. But in the meantime, I wish you all the best with the book. And please, Ernie sent me a note here, my producer, Ernie, please keep us posted on this fight within the school system. So goes the nation. So let's make your adventure something we can keep following, and come back and talk some more about this school board, because that's where your head is right now. And
thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the time. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I hope it hasn't been too difficult for you.
No, it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I held forth a little more than I usually do. I took up more airtime here, but that's because your book I found so interesting in our sort of differing approach to things, and at the same time, the unanimity we have on so many core ways of looking at things. So it just struck me as interesting. So I've talked more than I usually do, as I'm doing right now. But that's your fault, because your book sparked a lot of thought, which isn't all bad, is it?
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Much love to you. All the best at the wedding.
Thank you.
Grace and good things. And in all seriousness, you tell this young son of yours that you just were interviewed by a guy who got married when he was 17, and he's been married 53 years.
That's wonderful.
Don't change anything. You have my contact information. If he ever wants to talk to me, I'm being serious. The offer stands. I will FaceTime with him anytime to congratulate him. And I'm a military parent, and my son was in the Marine Corps. I get it. So I make that as a wedding present to him. There's this crazy old white guy living north of Boston who's ready to talk to you.
Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
See you later, Melanie. Bye.
Bye.